Hi friends, I hope you're all doing well. In past videos, I've shown different ways to start a collage, whether it's adding paint or paper on the ground layer. Sometimes it helps to start with something on this layer instead of staring at a blank substrate. It can provide ideas for a color palette, composition, or design. I thought it'd be a good idea to combine 30 simple ways to start a collage in one video. My hope is that you can use this video as a reference. Of course, there's endless ways to start a collage, but for now, let's start with 30. I'm working in a sketchbook, so I'm putting paper behind the page I'm working on to protect the other pages. One of the easier ways to start a collage is to paint a messy ground. In this example, I'm using 3 paint colors that are analogous, but you can use any colors you like. I brought out 3 flat brushes to apply the paint, one for each color. You can certainly use round brushes instead. I like painting organic blob shapes, but you can paint messy stripes, squares, or any other shapes that you gravitate towards. Also, I like to balance the colors, so I started by placing 3 yellow oxide blobs in different areas. The blob's location helps to set the placement for the other ones to come. You can blend the edges where the colors meet or leave the edges as is. It depends on your personal style or how you want this layer to look. I'll add music while you watch me finish this first ground layer. I kept out some of the paint colors and brushes for this next technique, which is painting an ombre. For this example, I'm only using yellow-orange light and yellow oxide. Having only 2 colors for the ombre keeps it simple, but you can use more colors if you would like. If you haven't painted an ombre before, I suggest working from the top down. I chose the lighter of the 2 yellows for this position. Also, I like the look of an ombre when the colors are not evenly painted. Yellow-orange light will cover a smaller area on the substrate, while the yellow oxide will cover the remaining larger section. I'm starting by applying yellow-orange light halfway down the substrate. This will help to blend the 2 colors together. I'm applying the yellow oxide slightly below the edge of the yellow-orange light, so this section will be pure color. Then start blending it on top of the yellow-orange light. You can blend it evenly, or another way is to dry brush where the 2 colors meet. I'm blending 2 colors, so having more than one brush helps with this process. Once I have the area where the 2 colors meet finished, then I'm applying the yellow oxide over the lower half of the substrate. I find if you're new to painting an ombre, this technique helps to achieve an even color transition. I'm using Payne's Gray for this next technique. I've been gravitating towards this color instead of black when painting with a very dark color. Again, you can use any color you want. I like using a larger brush when painting gestural marks. Besides making it easier to paint large and bold, I have less control over how the marks will look. I'm painting marks in different areas of the substrate, so enough of these marks will still be visible after I collage on top. You are seeing me go over the marks to make the color more pronounced in some areas. I like creating various opacities when using one color. It makes the marks more interesting. Also, I like how some of the edges are dry brush and others are smooth. Different size round brushes can be used to create different size splatters. I'm starting with a size 4 round brush for small splatters. You can use your index finger to flick the brush to make the splatter marks, or you can use a second brush and tap the brush with paint on it. Whichever way works best for you. I prefer the second method. The next size brush is a size 10. I like having different size splatters on a substrate. It adds an interesting detail to this simple technique. You can also use different colors as well. Also, you can cover the whole substrate with splatters or concentrate it in certain areas. It's not a technique that can be too controlled, but you can splatter the paint in the general area you want it to be in. Pour splatters is a relatively new technique to me that I want to explore further. I've tried it a few times and really enjoy the process. It's a fun way to start a collage because it's another technique that's a bit unpredictable. For me, that's the fun part about it, besides getting a splatter of colored shapes. I found these red plastic cups at my local grocery store. They have the perfect size for this technique. I washed them so they can be reused. Also, having a straw will help move the paint around the substrate. A viewer recommended it to me when I tried this technique for the first time. This is a technique that's a trial and error for the right paint consistency. I equate the consistency of this first paint color to heavy cream. Flipping the cup onto the sketchbook page can be tricky. You can see me pause for a second before flipping it onto the page. I would recommend using a single sheet of paper if you're trying this technique for the first time. Keep the cup of paint upright, then cover the opening with a single sheet of paper, then flip it over so the paint will spread onto the paper. That's an easier application. As you can see, the straw is used to blow the paint around the surface. Move the straw around, then continue to blow the paint in different directions. As I mentioned, this technique is unpredictable, but you can get the paint placed in the general area. Also, since the paint consistency was on the thicker side, the paint isn't splattering too far. For a thinner consistency, just add more water. I brought out watercolor so you can see how this technique looks with it. It will have a thinner consistency. Also, I thought this layer needed another splatter element in a different color. I found that using a brush to add water gave me more control than pouring the water directly into the cup. As you can see, the watercolor's thin consistency yields a different splatter design. A fan brush is a fun way to apply paint. This is a size 4 fan brush. I like to lightly dip the brush into the paint so as not to damage the bristles and to make sure there isn't too much paint. For my style of art, I prefer a more uneven dry brush look. Like a regular brush, you can apply the paint in long strokes. These vertical stripes would be great over the whole surface. Also, I like to apply the paint in short strokes to get this interesting pattern. Or even painting horizontal stripes. Combining all three patterns is another way to have an interesting layer to collage on top of. One of my favorite non-traditional art supplies is my collection of hardware paintbrushes. They have dense, stiff bristles, which are fun to play with. I decided to use this 2-inch paintbrush. You can get a solid application of color, or dry brush effect, or a combination of both. I wanted to show one more way to use these brushes with a slightly angled brush. It can create interesting gestural marks. The slight horizontal marks you see on the substrate were caused by the two papers that were behind the page. It was not intentional, but I like the way it turned out. It adds an interesting detail. If you don't like those marks, I would suggest using one large piece of paper or not putting any behind the page. Another favorite non-traditional art supply is plastic gift cards. It's another tool that creates uneven gestural marks. I find that it's easier to apply the paint along the edge of the gift card using a palette knife. Also, I suggest having a few in different widths. As I'm doing here, I applied the darker paint with a wide card. Then I came back in with a lighter color and applied it with a cut card. You can get an interesting layering design that creates a good ground layer. I kept out the palette knife to show that it can be used as well. It can't hold too much paint, but it can hold enough to make short stroke marks to create an uneven pattern. As you probably picked up, I enjoy making uneven patterns. I think they're more interesting to use in a collage than an even pattern. I have a 4-inch and a 2-inch brayers in my supplies. I like to use a small gel plate to apply the paint to the brayer. You can also use disposable palettes or paper plates instead of a gel plate. Anything that will help you apply the paint to the brayer. I applied the paint to the gel plate as I would if I was monoprinting. Instead of making sure the paint was evenly distributed on the gel plate, I'm making sure the paint is evenly distributed on the brayer. This is one time that I want the paint evenly distributed on a tool because I want to get as much paint as possible on the substrate. Even though the paint is evenly applied to the brayer, the paint isn't applied evenly to the substrate, and that's okay. The main goal was to have enough paint on the brayer to apply to the substrate. Using small gel plates as stamps is a great way to add patterns to the ground. I kept one of the plastic covers that come with the gel plate on the side that won't have paint. As you know, gel plates are very flexible, so keeping the plastic cover on helps to stabilize it. Apply the paint and create a pattern as you normally would for monoprinting. One of my favorite marking tools to use for this technique is a plastic fork. I like to place my fingers on the plastic cover and the side of the gel plate so I have a somewhat secure hold. Add pressure onto the backside of the gel plate so the painted pattern will transfer onto the substrate. This is almost a clean print, but I'm okay if the print isn't perfect. I wanted to add one more print, so I brought out this 3-inch by 5-inch plate. This time I'm using the other end of the fork to create a simple swirl pattern. Again, do the next steps as before. A simple watercolor layer can be an inspirational way to start a collage. I wanted to show you what a messy layer would look like with using only one color. You can get a wonderful variation of opacity with one color. I'll be starting with the 3/4 inch flat brush to apply a heavy blob, then blend it out with water to get a sheer wash of color. Repeating the process throughout the substrate, I will switch my brush to a round size 8 for a slightly more precise application and bring out a shop towel to pick up any excess paint where I want a lighter opacity. Again, you can create messy shapes or stripes or even plaids with watercolor. Instead of blending out the color, you can do a dry brush technique as well. Any way you decide to paint with watercolor, remember it doesn't have to be perfect. I want to mention that this sketchbook doesn't have watercolor paper. It's 75-pound typical sketchbook paper. The paper held up pretty well with all the layers of watercolor. When I'm referring to coarse salt, I'm talking about either sea salt or kosher salt. The size must be large enough so it will react with the watercolor we'll be using. Also, the salt in this container is over 10 years old, but I can still get a good effect with it. I don't recommend putting used salt back in its original container. I suggest having a separate container for it. There'll be some paint remaining on the salt, and you don't want it to contaminate the unused salt. Since I'm using the same color as I did with the used salt, I'll be pulling from this container. I suggest working fast with this technique. You get better results if the watercolor is very wet. It's a trial and error process on the amount of water to use. Since this technique creates an overall effect and is messy, you can work in sections if you would like. As I mentioned, this sketchbook doesn't have watercolor paper. I wasn't sure how fast it would dry, so I applied the watercolor and the salt in 2 sections. Then I went back and added more salt. You'll get good results if you use a lot of salt. After enough salt was applied, I let the paper completely dry. As you probably can guess, I let it air dry and avoid using any electric dryer, but I thought I should mention it. Once the paper is dry, you can remove the salt by angling the substrate to see how much of it will fall off, or you can brush off the salt, or you can do a combination of both. Continuing with watercolor, another simple technique is to use plastic wrap to get a unique texture on the paper. I suggest having enough pieces cut so it's ready to use. This is another technique that yields good results when the watercolor is very wet. I'll be creating an ombre, so I'm starting at the top with the first color, making sure I apply a generous amount of water, then the watercolor. I find that this technique yields good results if both the watercolor and water are applied heavily. Once I get the area of the substrate covered, I lay the crumpled plastic wrap on top. Then I repeat these steps for the lower half of the substrate. I decided to do the lower half in 2 sections to make sure the watercolor is wet enough. You don't necessarily need to create an ombre, it's just a design I wanted to create. Any design will work. You do get better results if the watercolor is completely dry when you pull up the plastic wrap, but you can get good results if it's damped. I wanted to show you both dryness levels. The top section was completely dry and the bottom section was damp. I was able to go back into the lower section and stamp the plastic wrap to get more texture. I started working with this technique when I used bubble wrap during a monoprinting session and found that the painted bubble wrap made a good print on paper. You don't need a large section of bubble wrap unless you want to cover the whole substrate. I like using scraps with small and large bubbles. You can apply a wash of color to the substrate first before printing with the bubble wrap. I chose not to do this step so you can see what the substrate will look like with just the bubble wrap print. I would recommend applying the paint using a gel plate instead of using a brush. The pressure of applying the paint with a brush may take too much time and may pop some of the bubbles. Apply the paint to the gel plate as you would when monoprinting. Gently tap the bubble wrap onto the painted gel plate. You don't have to apply too much pressure to get a good coverage of paint. Then lay the painted bubble wrap onto the substrate in the area you want to print and gently apply pressure. The print won't be perfect even if all the bubbles are intact, but you will get an interesting pattern print. While the paint is still wet on the gel plate, you can add more paint to the bubble wrap to fill in any area or to create another full or partial print. Next, I want to show you this technique using smaller bubble wrap and an ink pad. This time, gently press the ink pad onto the bubble wrap. Get as much ink on it as possible. I placed the scrap paper on the adjoining page to protect it from getting any ink on it. This isn't a necessary step, just something I wanted to show. Then I continued printing. You can see where the bubbles are deflated. I love the unevenness of this printing method. This is another technique that you can apply a wash of color on the substrate first, then use the stencils. Again, I decided to only use the stencils. I cut this dot stencil myself, but you can certainly use store-bought ones. These large letter and number stencils are store-bought. You can use the sections removed from each stencil as a mask if you want as well. I have two types of stencil brushes, flat and round. I prefer to use a flat brush on paper. If you don't have any stencil brushes, a makeup sponge works just as well. Even though the stencil covers the whole substrate, I want to show how it would look if I only use a section of it. Next, I wanted to add another stencil on top of this section. This is either a letter or a number stencil. I guess the stencil can represent either the letter O or a number 0. Anyway, I'm applying it on top of the other stencil area in a way that it doesn't read as either one, but a design element. Instead of paint, I brought out black ink pads and will apply it in a stamping motion. I put a paper towel along the edge to see if I could concentrate the ink within the stencil. It did get messy, but I'm okay with that. I don't mind imperfection. Also, I'll be collaging near or over this part of the stencil area. Next up is stamps. I like to use stamps that I make, but you can certainly use store-bought ones. I wanted to show a very small sample of my stash. I'll be using two of the smaller stamps with colored inks. This is another technique that you can apply a wash of color on the substrate first, but I'll only be using stamps. Also, I'll be only covering a section of the substrate. Next is a cardboard roll. I love using common household items as marking tools. It's best to cut it down to a size that's manageable or use a smaller one. You can add a wash of color on the substrate, but again, I'm only using the cardboard roll. This time I'm covering the whole substrate to create a layered pattern. First, I'm stamping gray circles. Again, this will be an uneven pattern. I like how some of the circles are slightly thicker than others. It gives a simple pattern an interesting design. Next, I'm taking the other end of the roll and pushing it together to create a narrow shape. I will stamp this shape over the whole surface, creating a vertical design with orange paint. This sea sponge is probably the most unused art supply I have in my stash. To be honest, I forgot I had it. I'm going to keep it out so I can remember to use it more often. Anyway, it gives a fun textural pattern. It looks dirty, but I washed it ahead of time. The paint is embedded into the sponge, so I'm not concerned about it contaminating the other paint I'll be using today. My plan is to do an all-over pattern using this green and blue paint. It's a nod to the sea. I find it best to use the sponge like you would a stencil brush or when you're stippling. Don't overload the sponge with paint. If it looks like there's too much paint, unload some of it on a paper towel. It's best to have not enough paint on the sponge than too much. Too much paint will create blobs. I like to move my hand around so the pattern will be going in different directions. I'll be showing two ways to use bleeding tissue paper. In this section, I'll show how to stain the substrate with it. But first, I want to mention that when purchasing bleeding tissue paper, make sure the package has the word bleeding on it. Speaking from experience, I purchased it when it was listed in the description area, not on the package. You can use regular tissue paper, but bleeding tissue will stain the substrate. Also, it's good to have a spritzer water bottle on hand. If you haven't used bleeding tissue paper before, it needs to be wet to activate the dye. I'm only using 2 different colors for this example, but you can certainly use more. I'm tearing the paper into different organic shapes and placing them in a loose design, slightly overlapping the shape so when the water is applied to it, the dye will run onto the other shapes, creating interesting colors and textures. Since the tissue paper is lightweight, I gently hold down the sections that are being spritzed with water. I suggest going light on the water first. It's another trial and error process to learn how much water to use. Once all the tissue paper is covered with water, let it sit and watch to see if the dye is starting to bleed. I like to use the end of a paintbrush or something similar to make sure the tissue paper touches the substrate and the other tissue paper. Add additional water in sections that look dry or there's no bleeding effect. I thought the orange area may not have enough color variation, so I added this small brown scrap. Then let the tissue paper sit until it's dry. I suggest letting it air dry instead of using a hair dryer. You don't want any of the papers to fly off the substrate. Once the tissue paper is dry, gently pull it off the substrate. You want to keep these altered papers to use for the next technique. There were 2 unstained areas on the substrate, so I added 2 small brown tissue papers and went through the same process again. These are the altered bleeding tissue papers from the last section. I think all of them turned out nicely. There's a good variation of colors and textures. There's a lot to work with. Instead of using all the pieces in one substrate, I'll be splitting them up and creating two separate ground layers. After trying different adhesives, I like using a liquid medium. This one happens to be a gloss medium, but you can certainly use a matte medium or Mod Podge. I like the shape of this large brown piece, so it's the starting point. Since I didn't have a lot of orange tissue paper, I wanted to use all three pieces on this substrate. I think it would be more impactful. I like to apply the adhesive in sections on the substrate for larger pieces, smoothing the tissue paper as I go to minimize the wrinkles, then add more adhesive on top. You want to make sure the tissue paper is properly sealed so it won't rub off. Since there's still dye on the tissue paper, I like to wipe and clean off my brush with water before dipping it back into the bottle of adhesive. I'm trying not to contaminate the liquid in the bottle with the dye from the tissue paper. Here's the first ground layer substrate. Let's go on to the next one. Even though I'm not using any of the orange tissue paper, I think these four altered brown papers have enough color variation to make a strong impact for the ground layer. I wanted to have a different design than the previous ground layer, so I'm using the pieces pretty much as is, only making slight adjustments. Next is painted deli paper. I like to use the ones that have a simple, either one or two color design. If you haven't used it before, it has a lightweight quality that is similar to tissue paper. It can tear and wrinkle easy, so you need to be aware of that when adhering it to the substrate. I brought out these scraps in a similar design since I'll be using them as a ground layer. I knew that I didn't want to cover the whole substrate, but I didn't have a design in mind. I had to try out different placements before deciding on one. You can also apply the painted deli papers on top of a collage for an interesting layered look. Once again, I'm using gloss medium to adhere the deli paper to the substrate. I love the patina of old book pages. It's a good ephemera to use to cover the blank substrate either partially or fully. For example, I'll be covering the whole substrate, varying the sizes and shapes of each piece. Also, I'll be mostly tearing the pieces because it fits with the theme of a worn look. When I use book pages, I like to position them either upside down or sideways. I don't want the text to be easily read. Once again, I'm using the gloss medium since it was sitting out on my table, but you can use any adhesive such as matte medium, Mod Podge, or even a glue stick. I go back and forth about whether it's necessary to seal the top of it. It's up to you. I'm applying the gloss medium on top of the substrate and on top of the book pages. One more thing, with this type of ground layer, you can use a muted color palette to coordinate with it, or you can use the complete opposite and use a bright color palette. This may be an unlikely choice of ephemera for a simple ground layer, but hear me out. It won't look so busy if the ephemera is grouped together by color than if the pieces were randomly glued onto the substrate. The found ephemera are the two small white papers with text. These two papers will be grouped and glued together. Next, I'm going through the junk mail and cutting out sections that read mostly blue or red. Like the found ephemera, the blue pieces will be grouped and glued together, and the red pieces will be grouped and glued together. This way the papers will be seen as blocks of color. Also, placing the papers with the text either upside down or sideways will help as well. From permanent markers to paint pens to water-soluble pens, markers are a great way to create a ground layer. Depending on the paper you're using, I would suggest putting a scrap of paper behind the page you're working on if you're creating in a sketchbook. I added scrap paper because the paper in this sketchbook is 75 pounds, and some of the markers may bleed through to the other side of the paper. For this example, the design will be a loose, simple plaid, but you can draw any line work design you want. I'm starting by drawing horizontal wavy lines using this pink Posca paint pen. The line work will be uneven. To contrast with the pink horizontal wavy lines, the next set of lines will be loose, uneven black vertical lines. I think this slight difference will make this simple plaid more interesting to look at. Like markers, color pencils can be a great tool to create an interesting, simple ground layer. I chose 3 analogous colors to create a loose block pattern. I'm starting by adding a few lavender blocks in different locations as a guide to help balance the colors around the substrate. This isn't a necessary step, but it's one that I like to do. It can help ensure that when you're collaging on top, all 3 colors will be visible. Also, you'll notice that the size of the blocks are not the same. As you've seen throughout this video, my art style leans towards uneven and imperfect designs. I encourage you to create these ground layers in your style, or if you want, give my style a try. I like using a water-soluble pencil when I want a messy ground layer. This style of loose circular design is one of my favorites. It's a good base layer for a radiating composition. I like to add water with a brush and let the pigment bleed over the surface. I love the variation of opacity that comes with this technique. Since it's water-soluble, I would suggest applying some sort of sealant on top to protect it. This pencil does come in different colors, but I bought only black. I wasn't sure how I was going to use it, so black was a safe choice. I'm looking forward to purchasing different colors. Next, I wanted to show what it would look like if the design was concentrated in one area. Same technique as the circular design. I drew squiggly marks down the right side of the substrate. Then I came in with water on a brush to bleed out the color. Journaling can be a great way to inspire a collage and a color palette. I'm not writing anything personal for this example. For your artwork, write whatever you feel comfortable with. If you're not interested in journaling, you could write or copy a poem or a song. I wrote out what I wanted to say in pencil beforehand, but that's not a necessary step. Also, it's not my usual style to write so the words are right side up or legible, but I wanted to do it for this example. I only brought out black markers and pens, but of course you can write in any color or you can just write in pencil. I would suggest not making the writing too colorful because you don't want it to distract from the collaging that you'll be doing on top of it. Another thing I think is fun is to write using different fonts. It's a good way to practice them. I must admit my penmanship has gotten worse over time. When I write on top of pencil marks, I like to erase as much as I can. I typically like to use a kneaded eraser because I think it erases cleaner. This is a plastic eraser, which works fine as well, but you need to be careful not to apply too much pressure. It may smear the ink. If you enjoy writing with different fonts, I suggest try graffiti writing. You can use traditional graffiti fonts or create your own. I kept out black markers and pens from the last section. As I mentioned then, you can certainly use colored markers and pens, but be aware of not making it too colorful. It will distract from the collaging that you'll be doing on top of it. I sketched a few words in different graffiti fonts using a pencil. This first style I believe is called Bubble. I decided to make it my own by adding diagonal lines inside each letter. It's a nice detail and it camouflages my rough penmanship. I don't recall the name of this font. It usually has a drop shadow or a thick border around each letter. I brought out black paint and a small angle brush to write this next word. It's not based upon a certain font. I wanted to add another word in this style to show that any font can be considered a graffiti font. It doesn't have to be in a traditional graffiti style. You can switch it up by writing smaller size words over the rest of the substrate. I'm filling up the rest of the blank area by repeating the 3 words already on the page and adding one new one. Have fun with this style of writing and make it your own. We're wrapping up this video with my favorite type of writing, which is asemic writing. If you haven't heard of it before, it's an abstract writing style. The words and letters are illegible. I like it because I can get my thoughts out on the page, but nobody will be able to read it. It's a great way to unwind. This writing style is an excellent pattern for a ground layer. You can vary the widths and the heights of the words. You can use different colors and different writing tools. Also, the color can convey the meaning behind the writing. I felt particularly happy this day, so I decided to use a pink paint pen. As you watch me work on this last page, I want to leave you with a few suggestions. You can prep a few pages ahead of time, so when you have time to collage, the first layer is done. Also, having different pages done, then you can decide on which one you want to work on during that collaging session. I know with me, some days I'm inspired by bright, colorful ground layer. Other days I'm inspired by a dark, muted ground layer. Having options is good, especially if you have a limited time to create. In future videos, I'll use these ground layers as a starting point for collaging. I think it'd be helpful to see how I use them. I hope you found this video helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. I appreciate you watching. Take care.